Before we start, I want to thank Lindsay Hinman for becoming our newest Patreon supporter. If you want to learn more about Patreon and different ways you can support the podcast, you can go to mountainprairie.com/support. And secondly, I want to remind everybody, in case you haven't seen it, I send out a bi-monthly book recommendation email, and I've been doing it for coming up on 8 years now. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to mountainprairie.com/reading. You can see all the past book recommendations I've put out. I'll be putting out a new one here at the end of June for May and June of 2023. It's not really necessarily books about the West. It's kind of books from all over the place. It's kind of a crazy mix of books, but people seem to enjoy it, and the list continues to grow, and I think it adds some value. So if you're interested, go to mountainprairie.com/reading to sign up. Thanks a lot. This is the Mountain Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is David Gessner. David is no stranger to Mountain Prairie listeners. He's joined me for many episodes over the years, and he's the author of many of my favorite books, including All the Wild That Remains, Leave It As It Is, My Green Manifesto, and more. His newest book is called A Traveler's Guide to the End of the World, Tales of Fire, Wind, and Water, which once again showcases David's unique ability to combine humor, travel, and memoir in service of connecting the reader with the natural world. A Traveler's Guide to the End of the World chronicles David's journeys around the country, where he finds himself in the middle of an unsettling number of climate disasters, from historic forest fires in the American West to hurricanes on North Carolina's Outer Banks. Eschewing the ubiquitous facts, figures, and policy debates that often dominate climate-focused books, David does what he does best. He tells stories. Specifically, he tells impactful, insightful stories from the front lines of the climate crisis, stories that'll stick with the reader for years to come. As has been our tradition for several years now, David and I met up in Boulder, Colorado, where he and his family visit each summer. We obviously talk a lot about the book, but as is the case whenever we get together, the conversation flows into many fun and unexpected topics. You can check out the episode notes for a full list of everything we discussed, but some of the topics include David's recent writing workshop at the Zapata Ranch with his friend, author Craig Childs, the importance of momentum and dailiness in writing, how David's daughter was the influence for his new book, optimism versus pessimism when reporting current events, thoughts on death and loss, David's good friend, the late Mark Spitzer, the next generation of conservation-minded writers, some great book recommendations, and the idea of being a, quote, polygamist of place, and much, much more. I'm always happy to have the opportunity to sit down with David for a conversation, so I greatly appreciate his carving out the time. I hope you can check out A Traveler's Guide to the End of the World, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks for listening. David Gessner, we're not at a ping pong table, but it's good to be back with you in person. Last time we did one of these, it was over Zoom, but the two, remember that? It was right during COVID when the TR book came out, which I loved, by the way, and I could talk about that the whole time. But we did it via Zoom, and it was awesome, but it was not this. So here we are, Chautauqua, which may be better than the. But thank you for taking the time to do this. And I don't even really know where to start because I got so many questions for you, but maybe the first place we start is your recent Zapata Ranch retreat, because you did a version, probably a much more fun version of what I did, and I want to hear how it went. So how was it?
Well, first, this is the first time I've spoken to you that you've been a mega Western star. So I'm a little intimidated now talking to you. We've been doing this for years.
You did seem kind of nervous when I walked in.
So Zapata, which I did with Craig Childs, a writer known throughout the West, was fantastic. We had 10 students who we, drilled on writing in the morning. We were a great team. It was the first time I've been with somebody where I was kind of the straight man. I'm much less wild. I would talk to them about form and paragraphs and cutting between different subjects. And then Craig would take them out and, in his loincloth and point and say, write 6 words about this juniper tree. But it worked really well together, and he's a great guy and super generous. And so we'd teach them in the morning, then we'd hike to, frozen waterfalls or go horseback riding. And meanwhile, we had this crazy thing going on where Andre Ham, who's a son of a good friend of mine, is a Wim Hof instructor. And so we'd all get in cold buckets of water at the end of the day, and there was some kind of primal chanting after that. It sounds a little too men's movement-y, but at the end of the week, I snuck off, and it was snowing, and I went and dipped in the frozen waterfall, so that was my triumphant end to the week. But it was great. People were hugging each other goodbye. And
that's awesome.
And I'm thinking, I told you earlier, I'm thinking of extending it so there's 5 or 6 days of teaching, and then people have 4 or 5 days of just writing, like a writing retreat.
Nice.
Because the whole thing I was pushing there, which I've talked to you about before, was momentum, which, if I had to say one sentence, what can I teach about writing? It's the value of momentum. Once you start pushing the rock forward, it starts rolling. And I think they got it during that week, but then they go home to their normal jobs and lives and can't keep it going. And I also feel like some people say, oh, you don't write every day. And for me, dailiness is a superpower. So I'd love to have a 10-day period with them to just get that feel of writing every day.
Yeah. I've been working, I told you, we've actually talked a bit about this, but I've been working a bit on a writing project, and I've been following your prescription as far as just forcing it to come and forcing every day to sit down and write. And it is powerful because I never stuck to it for more than like 10 days. And after, there's something about like 3 weeks where it really, for me at least, that it was really different. So again, thank you for your instruction on that.
Well, I know that's not what we're here to talk about today, but I mean, to me, it was really interesting. I worked as a framing carpenter in my 20s, and it was really like, you'd see frames go up so fast because, you slam them together, and then the finished work takes forever. So I always thought of it in terms of a framing draft, getting a framing draft down there, kind of like Anne Lamott's shitty first draft. But now more and more, I feel like while I'm doing the first draft, I'm also doing the second and third drafts. And there's a great line by Samuel Johnson, which I'll mangle, but it's like he's asked to give writing advice. And one of them is kind of weird, which is learn to write fast. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? But if, like journalists, like if you have to get something done, you start training yourself to not be intimidated by the blank page.
We were talking a few months back, and you had been in a sabbatical away from teaching. How did that affect your not having that teaching taking up a portion of the day? How was that for your writing? Was it weird not having that kind of anchor? Or
it was like a rocket taking off.
Was it really?
Yeah, it was great. The only downside was the day I wrote too much. And I said, that's what they're going to put on my tombstone. He wrote too much. Where, I mean, it was funny, but I got a blood clot in my left leg because I didn't get up and stretch enough. And I had to, so there are writing injuries that you can get.
That's pretty hardcore.
Yeah. But it's better now. And, and I think that I do like the balance of teaching, just as I like the balance of working out and things to get you out of your brain. But I'm fine with another sabbatical.
I'm always just amazed by the prolific nature of everything you do. And it seems like, I feel like I remember you telling me a few months back that your agent or the publisher, somebody's like, hey, wait a minute here. We're getting a backlog of books here. I mean, how many books would you say you've written in the last 18 months?
Well, it's hard to tell because like a lot of writers, more writers than you'd know, I have stillborn projects. I have projects I've been working on for literally 30 years at this point. Most of those are fiction. My joke with my students is I'm not a successful nonfiction writer. I'm a failed novelist. And I really, you talk a lot about kind of having these visions and kind of trying to fulfill them. I turned 60 recently, and I really want to turn to publishing fiction. It's, I can't help but keep doing nonfiction because the world's so screwed up that I have to respond to it. But I during that sabbatical, and I have a little time coming off in the fall, I really want to return to fiction because I have several novels that haven't made it into the world.
Yeah.
And the one I'm working on now, I like quite a lot. So, I always have a main book I'm working on, but I like to have a counter book too. So I don't know what the answer is exactly, but I've had these last series of nonfiction books have been kind of chronicling almost in real time. The one was through the pandemic, then the new one is traveling after the pandemic. But at the same time, I've been working on a couple novels. So,
and with all the writing you do, and you're constantly writing, constantly thinking, how do you know when you've got a book on your hands versus just an idea? Because I want to talk about the new book, because it's perfectly in line with everything that you've written before. Like, it's definitely a David Gessner book,
right?
But in some ways, I felt like it may be more personal, maybe because you're bringing your daughter. A lot of it is around your daughter. I mean, all your books are personal to an extent, but it was a really unique thing to read, and I think some of it was unique because some of the facts in there and the timeline, like, I knew about. Like, I remember when you were here last year,
right,
and you had or a few years ago, and you had COVID,
right,
and things like that, and so it was kind of like I was more involved, at least more closely involved. So how did this book in particular become?
Well, that's a good way to answer the general question too. Yeah. Because it's a good example. So during COVID, obviously, I was working on a couple of projects, but what started to happen is I realized I'd written an essay early on about Thoreau and the pandemic, and it had gotten some attention. And then I started to think about other ways that Thoreauvian philosophy applied to that time we were in, and so that book started to evolve. But once I started traveling again, the very first trip I took was to D.C. to do an interview with someone, and I couldn't believe the place, like that it was so closed down. It looked like a war zone. People with guards with guns. I interviewed by phone Jamie Raskin, who was my college classmate, and just got this sense of a place under siege. And also a sense of, I'm not an apocalyptic thinker, but a little bit of that coming in. So the next thing I did, not thinking of it as a book at all, is I came out here where we're talking to Boulder. And it was a place that for Nina and I have these great memories. And we met here and got married here. And it was covered in smoke. So, of course, that kind of went with the D.C. thing. I traveled out to see Ken Slight, Seldom Seen Smith from the Monkey Wrench Gang, who was 91, I think. Wow. And he just had experienced the Pack Creek fire, which had incinerated the Quonset hut in which he kept all his writing, all his memories and journals of traveling with Ed Abbey. And he was completely depressed, of course, and said, I feel like I've lost everything. The next night, I went to the fire meeting, with the residents of Pack Creek, a very small community, I don't know, like a couple hundred people. And one of the things they said, I remember, was we wouldn't be too worried about flash floods because the soil looks good. The next night was a birthday party for Ken's wife, Jane Slight. I met Clark Abbey at this party, having a good time. All of a sudden, we hear this rumbling roar like a freight train go out, and Pack Creek is tearing down, full of tree limbs and rocks and boulders. And I walked right to the edge of it and kind of, I'd never seen a flash flood before. And by that point, I was like, holy crap. I'm not trying to see climate. I live on the hurricane coast where this time of year, it's June now, we start getting anxious, right?
Oh, yeah.
So people who were saying, oh, climate isn't here, suddenly I was like, whoa. Then I traveled to Salt Lake City for a reading, and I was already that far west, and I just said, screw it. I'm going to go to Paradise, California, because I knew a new fire was coming in. Yeah. And I went there and started talking to people, and that's where someone said to me, climate change is a personal story. It's my story, too. So then I kind of was, by then, it had gone from just something happening to me to being, while I drove to Paradise, it was already kind of like factoring and figuring in how this was going to fit together. And then I pushed it a little bit, but some I didn't push. For instance, I went to a former student who'd published a novel's wedding in New Orleans, and Ida had just come through 3 weeks before. So the interesting thing to me is the book chronicles about a year and a half of travel. Most of it was not intentional I'm going to go find climate disasters. Most of it was climate disasters happened to me.
Yeah, you were in the middle of it.
Yeah. So at some point, I'm working on something right now, and I'm feeling it change from just an essay or a couple essays into a book. Mm-hmm. And I'm not crazy about having books come out anymore. There's a lot of crap that goes with it, a lot of self-promotion. But I love making books, and I love the stage of going like, oh, this fits here and that goes there. And that to me is really, it's one of the most satisfying ways to spend time on earth for me, just to think about that and then start putting it together.
Well, it fits in so well, I think, with just your personality. For people that have read your book, you're the kind of coming back to life here in Boulder after you had your cancer scare and really getting stronger and learning to love, for lack of a better term, whipping your own ass, riding up Flagstaff, running up the mountains. And I was thinking that same thing as I've been struggling with the writing, is that in the moment, for me at least, it's not all that fun.
Right.
But then when you push through or when you're done and you gave it a good effort, there's very few feelings better. As far as professional, like white collar, typing away, click, 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 that. I mean, it's a good feeling.
Well, it also might change for you. You might feel less like it's kicking your ass. You might, it takes a little time. There's a great Samuel Johnson quote that I just learned this year, which is, to do something with ease, first do it with rigor.
I like that.
I mean, I'm not one of those people who hates writing. I love writing, but I had a good decade where I wasn't so crazy about it when I was starting out, right?
Early in the book, you talk about something that I really agree with, like facts and figures are not going to be really changing anybody's mind about climate change. And I actually had the head scientist for Nature Conservancy on the podcast a few months back, and she says the same thing.
Yeah.
And she says that you can spit numbers all day. If numbers and information were going to solve this problem, the problem would have been solved a long time ago.
Right.
And so talk about kind of what your goal is for the book, because you bring your humor and you bring your irreverence. And I was really like some of the words you use, like when you're talking about putting your daughter in your car without air conditioning, you said it was like sliding her into a kiln.
Yeah.
And so it's really funny, but it's a serious subject. Yeah. So how do you balance that out? Shouldn't it just be we all crying and screaming and angry?
Well, first, I've revised, even though it's in the book, I'm not sure kiln was the right word choice since we were in North Carolina. Kiln would be Arizona, right? I don't know what it would be, like a sweat lodge or something. I don't know.
Steam room?
Steam room. So here's what I've been, one of the motivators for the book was I'm so tired of what I call the tropes of hope, the tropes of doom, the way climate has been written about. The only reason I'm nervous about saying that is I'm a huge Bill McKibben fan, and I understand he kind of set the groundwork with End of Nature. But for me, you get these news forecasts that end on kind of a false uptick of hope. You get these diatribes. You get what you said, like these kind of fact-filled book reports. So I wanted to and there are examples. Ministry for the Future is a good example of a book that isn't like that. But I wanted to try to write in a little more complex, messy, and maybe even mature way about climate. To say, here is what I'm seeing. Here are the stories of the people. And of course, we'll talk about it later, but I get scientists to predict what the world's going to be like for my daughter, and here's what might be. But I wanted to do it without a moralistic aspect, big statistical weaponry. I wanted to do it in a way that was contradictory and messy. For instance, where it's pouring rain outside, there's snow all over the high country here, and I write about the drought that's going to kill us. So I'm open to that stuff. And my idea was that we're ready for not a simplistic. No, it doesn't have to. We don't have to have bullet points at the end. We don't have to say, here's what you need to do. It's all on you, climate change. You can read about it and see it. And the other thing, which is a little contradictory, is I quote the Churchill line early on. He mobilized the English language and sent it into battle, which about fighting the Germans. And I said we could do that with climate too. Is the dog snoring a problem?
If anybody can hear snoring,
we have a snoring lab in the back.
It's a very cute.
It's hard to concentrate.
No, I like the snoring lab.
And so, I just wanted to kind of avoid the cliches of the genre and see if people responded. And like you say, I agree that stories are going to help more than statistics. But I also think stories, like we don't read a novel and then put it down and say, what should I do? Or what, it permeates us. Mm-hmm. And I think it's time, just as I described the weather out west or the smoke or the hurricanes, I think it's time for the literature to respond. I mean, there's a great Maya Angelou quote, which is, a bird does not sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song.
Mm-hmm. What do you make personally of just the way that the news of the West is reported? Because me personally, I think it's just overwhelmingly negative to the point that it like makes me angry. And maybe that's my problem, letting some external thing make me angry like that. But it doesn't convince me. If anything, it repels me, and I'm more bought in than most. I mean, I spent many years actually working in conservation, and it's kind of my hobby reading about it. And then when I'm confronted with this just extremely negative news or kind of gloom and doom, it repels me.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I mean, I think that very well may just be a weird personality quirk I have. But what do you think about talking about these issues very negatively versus more positive, proactive, maybe not solution oriented, but just in a kind of what you've done? I mean, like, what do you think? Do you think about that at all, I guess?
I'm relieved and happy to be being interviewed by you. I've had some podcasts and interviews where people clearly haven't read the book, mm-hmm. and that's always frustrating. And so I'll say, this is not a book about policy, mm-hmm. and it's not necessarily a book about hope. And they'll pause and say, what about policy? What about hope? Mm-hmm. Basically. And if I'm pushed, first of all, I'll say that I consciously didn't want to, though there's plenty of positive, and me going into beautiful places in the book, the project I'm working on now is a lot more positive and hopeful, which is about the Yellowstone to Yukon path. But for me, the most hopeful thing personally, and it doesn't help the world necessarily, about my travels in the West is just being in these places where, okay, I'm aware of the stats, I'm aware of what's wrong, I'm aware of the fires and the beetle kill, but my God, the trip, I just came up from 2 miles north of the Mexican border, worked my way up here to Colorado, and the spectacular places I saw. And as I said, going through Leadville, it could be the middle of winter.
Yeah.
And the gushing rivers, and that sense that there still is the geography of hope, being fully aware of the disasters. And as Stegner said, really the West has always been the home of it's very fragile for such a big place.
Yes.
Not just aridity, but it's prone to large-scale cataclysmic events. And they're there and they're real, but I think you can hold those two things in your head at once. And so I guess if there's a moment where I'm up at the source of the Colorado River and I'm literally straddling the water that's going to give, that's the lifeblood of the West and gives water to 36 million people. And it's a non-snowy winter because it's the latest first snow on the Front Range. So there's plenty of climate worry. But my God, being there and seeing it flow under the ice and seeing that, that nature is our source was for me like primally exciting.
Yeah.
And so that's where I get by. I'm naturally a resilient person, I guess. I guess hopeful too, in the sense that this is the third time I've quoted Samuel Johnson. He says, "Without hope, there is no endeavor." Mm-hmm. You do need that as fuel for doing.
Yep.
But on the other hand, I don't want to be falsely hopeful, and I don't want to have to do it because people are like, "Oh, that's so depressing." Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? And no offense, because I sound like I'm attacking you.
No.
No, but I also think there's value to facing things honestly.
I agree.
But at the same time, I'm not going to respond to that by lying down, basically.
Well, I think what you said about being able to hold two ideas in your head at the same time, I think that's the missing piece that most people, I feel like sometimes there's certain groups of people who they just can't enjoy the beautiful landscape or whatever they're in the moment because they can't stop thinking about how awful it all is, or how awful this other side of things are. And I think that's a perfect way to say it is you got to be able to hold the two ideas in your head.
And I hate dogmatism, and I think, on the right, on the left, anywhere, any direction, just this having one idea prevail and not having any flexibility and not being nimble or being able to be fluid is. So in the book, at times I'll be in this place, and classic example is Ryan Lambert in southern Louisiana, who I've written about. He was the star of the Tarball Chronicles years ago, but I went back to see him, and I was pretty glad that we'd skipped the Trump years because we're political opposites, but we've always gotten along well. Maybe it would have been worse during those, but once, he's my friend, and he's fighting for the land, and he's a hunter and fisherman who knows the land in Buras in southern Louisiana, and he's literally through Ducks Unlimited has gotten a grant where he's redirected a section of the Mississippi to regrow sinking land. And it's, you can see the videos of it. It's miraculous.
Oh, wow.
It's lifted out of the water and become land again. He brought an environmentalist there, and she wouldn't step out of the boat thinking she was going to sink down. And sure enough, it's land again. And his line was, this is being done also by Louisiana on a large scale.
Yeah.
He pointed to the Mississippi and said, there's the doctor. And he pointed to the bay and said, there's the patient. Because all that sediment comes down and is dumped in the Gulf. But that sediment can regrow.
Yep.
So there's an example of somebody kind of who knows how resilient nature is and really knows the natural world and is doing something concrete and hopeful. On the other hand, it's a losing battle to some extent in parts of southern Louisiana. It's going away.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I grew up right up the road from where you live in Tarboro, North Carolina. And, and my family grew up going to Morehead City, Atlantic Beach.
Yep.
And my grandfather built a place there, in the 1950s. And my dad's mentality about it has always been like, if it lasts another year, it's like winning the lottery because it's all going to be gone one day. Yeah. One thing that I was reminded of when I read your book that I'd heard you talk about before, but I don't think you and I have ever talked about it. And I think it's a funny and interesting concept. And for people who may not be fully familiar with all your work, your idea of that you're a polygamist of place.
Yeah.
Polygamist of place. Can you talk about what that means to you? Because people hearing this with no context, they may think you're from here. You're from Colorado.
Yeah, or Utah.
Or Utah or Wilmington, North Carolina. Yeah. So
luckily it's not illegal to be a polygamist of place. So well, I guess it came from the idea that some writers I admire, Thoreau, Wendell Berry, I guess mainly it's Wendell Berry used the metaphor of marrying a place.
Yes.
Of finding your one place on earth that reflects your shadow and your soul, basically.
A sticker.
And committing to it and being a sticker. And he learned that in part from his teacher, Wallace Stegner, who always talked about boomers versus stickers and had those examples in his mother and his father. So growing up, I guess my first nature was really Cape Cod that I really connected with. But my dark secret as a nature writer is that I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts, which nobody would mistake for a paradise, a natural paradise. So when I was 30, or when I was 29, I moved back to Worcester with my girlfriend, and I won't go too deeply into it because I think we've talked about this before. And I found out I had testicular cancer, and during the radiation for the cancer, found out I was getting rejected by one creative writing grad school after another, and the one I got into was Boulder. So I always think of it as dividing my life at my 30th birthday into a before and after. And I was kind of airlifted out here. I actually drove an unregistered Buick Electra out here and just got healthy again and strong again. And eventually, I'd written a couple books, kind of clunky books where the characters quoted Thoreau to each other, but now I was really writing, and I was in El Dorado Springs, south of Boulder.
Yep.
And, and starting to work out pretty hard in the hills. And the first book I wrote didn't sell, but the next one did. Mm-hmm. And it turned out it was a book about my dad dying, but it was also a book about Cape Cod. So I'd written my Cape Cod book in Colorado. It wouldn't do for a Cape Cod nature writer to be in Colorado, so I moved to Cape Cod, turned around, wrote a book about Colorado and how much I loved it. Then my third book, Return of the Osprey, I did kind of end on a Wendell Berry-esque note where I said, I will stay on Cape Cod forever. And some professors from University of North Carolina, Wilmington read it, asked me to interview, hired me, and I moved to Wilmington, which in the last decade or so, I've really fallen in love with too.
Yeah.
So, and in the meantime, forays into Utah have become more. I just was at yesterday. I was at Bears Ears, which has become kind of an annual pilgrimage for me. So, between Utah, Colorado, Cape Cod, Wilmington, I feel like I love those places, and I take the tools from the different places to the places. But I do not have a Wendell Berry, this is my place forever.
Yeah.
Or if I say it again, it'll just mean I'll move to San Francisco or something. So that's what I mean by polygamous place. And I think it struck a chord with people because I think a lot of us live in geographic uncertainty. Uh-huh. And we're always planning for the future. I'm going to move there. I'm going to do this. I'm going to stay forever here. And, usually those plans get scuttled. And for many of us, financial reality is one of the things that determines where we are too.
Sure.
But I sure love it here. We're in Chautauqua Park right now and come out for a month every year.
Yeah, it's just funny how, as I think about when our paths first crossed, we didn't meet, but I knew of you when I was living in Wilmington, North Carolina, and my roommate was Doug Cutting, who was your student at the time. And I thought I was there to stay. And I was working at Merrill Lynch. Yeah. And, right over there in that landfall center place. And I think that's just who would have ever guessed that that I'd be out here in the West? I just never would have guessed it.
It's so great.
And it's kind of, it is like my second, it's like a home now. Very, very strange.
Well, you did it right too, because you plunged into the place and learned about it. And your connection to it is deepened, basically, and you read about it too. We can hike into places and know places physically, but learning the literature of the place is important too.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings, I'm thinking about just how you have, you immerse yourself in these places. You're not from here, but you've immersed yourself in it, and you've made a lot of your career about thinking and exploring ideas of it. And then a lot of the people you surround yourself with do the same, maybe with different topics, but it's just this passion for thinking and for learning and for putting ideas into the world. And that brings me to your friend, Mark Spitzer, who recently passed away and whose book is coming out in a few weeks. I'd love to just hear about your relationship with him, because you sent me this unbelievable cartoon you had done. I read a tribute that you had put up. I think maybe you'd put it on Facebook, and I read that. And he just seems like such a special guy. But on the surface, other than the love of writing, like, you're not obsessed with catching fish, right? But there's this bond of people that get obsessed. Yeah. And so I'd love just to hear about Mark.
Well, it's funny. I did a little homework before this. And one of the things I read was, I was like, what did I say in my blurb about Mark? and I just think of it because, I talk about fishing and I say, but the art of monster fishing, the book is called Monster Fishing, and it comes out in early July. But the art of monster fishing is also a metaphor for a certain kind of life, a vital and elemental life close to the currents of nature, a life beyond the merely human, a life that is no mere trudge from birth to death, but an embrace of this joyous and wild world and all it offers. And I think Mark really had that kind of wild spirit. In the cartoon you read, I said he wrote 30 books. I sent it to his widow, Leah Graham, and she corrected me and said it was 40.
That's like TR style book, right?
Yeah. And he, so my relationship with Mark kind of goes with the story I told before of moving to Colorado. He was one of the first people I met in the CU writing program. And I had been, I find myself always turning things back to writing, talking about it maybe too much, but I had been such a perfectionist in my 20s, and I hadn't shown my work to anybody, including my longtime girlfriend, and I'd only sent it out to a few big publishers and gut informed letters, though there was one letter that said, "You are a writer of considerable talent," before it rejected me, and I clung to that like a life raft. So I got out here, and I had a really bad first workshop. I thought I was going to be hailed as the Tom Wolfe of the, finally I was showing my work to people, and they would, of course, recognize the genius. That was not the case. And I retracted even more and got even more kind of wary of sending my stuff out. And along came this kind of nouveau beatnik, like he had Harpo Marx hair back then, and he was funny and wacky, and he always had an orange felt pen and would write whatever thoughts he had on his legs or arms or paper or whatever he had nearby. And what impressed me at first, many things, was he sent stuff out into the world, and he was fearless. And he sent it out. Back then, you used self-addressed stamped envelopes, and he would write it, send it to the New Yorker. He'd also send it to Dogfish Retro Journal or something. But there was a courage to it, and he would read his stuff, and he would put it out in the world. And he was a huge influence on me in kind of getting over this perfectionism. And I started to send stuff out, got tons of rejections, and then got published. So that's one clear influence Mark had. But he called himself Johnny Highway, and he was a big traveler. And that's, I didn't have that in my work back then. And he was an influence in that way too. And there were drugs involved. It was always fun and funny. And he would stay with my wife Nina and Melinda up in what he called the Mountain Palace. He would live in their basement and cook them breakfast. That's how he paid rent. And they called him his houseboy. Yeah. And it was just really fun and funny. And, then he'd go off and live in Shakespeare and Company in Paris for a while. And Mark was and all the while, nonstop, he was writing. And I mentioned to you, can I read a couple lines?
Yeah, please do.
Randomly opened the book, and the first lines I found were very Spitzer-esque, I guess. He's fishing for gar with his friend Minnow Bucket. all his characters have I was Gruff Dave.
I saw that.
Sweet Nina, he was appalled. He used to growl when I first started dating Nina. He did not like the idea of Gruff Dave and Sweet Nina being together. So Mark catches this gar. So I grabbed that gar, hugged it to my chest, and carried it to higher ground, feeling that rush I always feel when battling a beast hauled up from the underworld, which of course is totally juvenile, but that's the goal. To return to that youthful perspective, which adults feel less and less, the more deadened they get by the tribulations of their times. As Hemingway would have said, it was a good fish. But as I would say, it was a beautifully grotesque monster fish, all healthy and fangy and fattened up for winter. It was steel gray with a checkered scale pattern from head to tail. And then later, I again, just skimming through, because he has this kind of moral issue that he works through where he might not fish anymore. And that's what Thoreau did too, right? And he writes to his wife, "As I wrote to Leah in a text, such a purty fish, feel bad about killing it. The ghost of fish haunt me more and more." And that's when he starts kind of working through, he catches and release, but he realizes that can be dangerous for the fish too.
Sure.
So this book is kind of the story of his monster fishing, but also it's wacky Mark stories and tangents and rants, which is always part of the fun of reading his work.
And so you've had, a large amount of death, come into your life recently with, a lot of friends. And I think the last time we talked, it was when soon after your friend Brad Watson had died. Yeah. And then, there's a list. And it's a bland question, but how does it make you feel? As you're thinking about that, your daughter's in college. I don't know, as you're just kind of entering this phase of life where friends are starting to die. How do you think about that?
I wrote something in my journal before COVID, before I turned 60, and it was like, hard times ahead, basically, having watched my dad die young, and then it was my mom just died in December. That was a little different because she hadn't really been with us for a few years. Nina's dad died. A colleague, Philip Gerard, a great writer who I write about in that same essay about Mark, he died suddenly. He's only a couple of years older than me, and a great, prolific writer in the middle of his career, basically. So it is, and I had I actually write in this book about the death phobia I had when I was young. And I've kind of, like most of us, plastered over that, hidden it. That essay, there's a chapter called Beneath the Ice, which is about the hike to the source of the Colorado, but it's also about repression. And I think in an interesting way that what we're talking about in death and our awareness of death is a little bit like our awareness of climate. We tamp it down. The art of repression is a necessary one for us to keep going, but it's also blocking awareness, and letting it through. So I have that scene in the book where I'm here in Boulder and I'm driving down to hike up to the source of the Colorado, and kind of in a goofy way, I put on Rocky Mountain High because I'm back in Boulder. Woohoo! And I, like we do now, it's the John Denver Essentials. So then I keep driving, and I don't know what comes on. I'm leaving on a jet plane, or Sunshine on My Mind, or maybe Thank God I'm a Country Boy. But I just kind of listen in the background. And then Annie's song comes on. And Annie's song was my mom's favorite song. My mom, like me, could be kind of an extrovert at parties. She used to dance on top of pianos in high heels. And all of a sudden it comes on. And I've been not dealing with my mom at all, because I've had to deal with the business of my mom, of getting her into, along with my sister Heidi, getting her into the next home, just dealing with the practical aspects. And the first notes of Annie's song come on, and all of a sudden I'm bawling. I'm just like, oh my God, my beautiful mom, my mom is gone. I can't believe it. And I pull over on the way to Mark Harger's house in this little park. And I just have half an hour of just throbbing catharsis. And that's what's lurking down below the ice. That's what's there. And of course, we can't have that all the time, or no books will get written. That's for sure. So how do I feel? I feel kind of like my normal self going forward, but with an awareness of this thing that's coming for me too. And a shortening timetable, and I know 3 widows now who I'm close friends with who have had this cataclysmic thing happen to them, and how did they feel? How did they get through the day? So to kind of relate it to the book, which I try to do in the book, is I think what we've got going on is this future ahead of us that we're in deep denial about, and that's part of not doing anything, and that part of it is what can we do, as individuals, but it's right there. And to me, that's a good comparison between those two things. And as you brought up Hadley, and I know we're going to talk about it, that's when it really hits home, is kind of imagining the world that she's going to find later on.
Yeah, and that we have not hit on that yet, but will you talk about that part of the book, like the idea of you thinking about your age and then looking at your daughter? Because you're like 15 years ahead of me. So I can see it very clearly. And we both had kids pretty late compared to a lot of my younger sister has kids, getting ready to go to college.
Right.
And I've got a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. And so talk about that aspect about looking at your daughter and then thinking about the climate.
Well, Hadley has an activist gene that I lack. She started the Sunrise, which is the high school version of McKibben's organization. Started that at her school. She gave a talk at City Hall. So she's always been pretty climate active. But as I started to directly face climate for the first time, I've been a little resistant of writing about it, in part because of my contrarian impulse to go against what the big topic is. And this, as I said, was kind of forced on me by my travels. I started to ask people I met, but also top scientists, what the world would be like when Hadley was my age. I was 42 when she was born, so the math was, I think at the time, that it was, what will the world be like in 2062, or maybe it's 63? And I got answers. And for instance, the first person to reply to me was Paul Weinberg. And he wrote, it was kind of fun to give these scientists creative writing assignments. And so he came back and he wrote a very beautiful piece about the skies in 2063. And he mentioned Mount Pinatubo, which in 1991 blew and put all these particulates into the air, and you'd have swirling red and orange sunsets on the West Coast, and all over, really. And so he kind of laid out what the air would be like and pointed out that 7 million people already die from, air pollution, and imagining ahead. And of course, last week, New York and the East Coast got a little taste of it, which is tragic and bad, but also good that the media center got an idea of what we're going to see. So, and then I asked Orrin Pilkey, who's a famous coastal geologist, about the Outer Banks. And, I started putting these pictures together. But in terms of how it relates to Hadley, I had lots of talks with her. She said to me, doom is normal. And I asked, what do you mean? She said, people in my generation, we think that this is coming. Mm-hmm. And for people who don't think that, I always point to her high school years as an example. Freshman year, Hurricane Florence hit Wilmington, where Hadley went to school, and her high school was turned into a shelter for a month. We didn't return home for a month from evacuating. And the next term, spring term, was her one good normal term. Yep. Then Hurricane Dorian hit the next fall, sophomore year. And then COVID came in. And of course, there were occasional school shooter warnings and everything else sprinkled in. So, that's what I would put as Exhibit A about if you tell me the world hasn't changed. And I won't get into it, but COVID in many ways is an environmental disaster as well. So what I really tried to do, almost as a thought experiment, was empathize with her and the future her. And, you're a Teddy fan, and what he said at the edge of the Grand Canyon, my children, think of our children's children. Mm-hmm. Well, that's also obviously a Native American long-held belief for thousands of years, but it's become almost a cliche of environmentalism. It's something we got to, again, break through the ice about and really not just think, but feel that world that they're going to have. Mm-hmm. Feel what that's going to be like, to go out and be coughing, and you'll be repurposing your old face mask for going out. Feel what it's going to be like to have, when the Northeast starts getting the hurricanes that we from Carolina are so used to. I hope, I pray that what we're having right now in the West continues for a few years, but drought is inevitable here. Yep. So these, can you, and I don't know that I can, but I tried to think about that world and just want to say to people, let's wake up to this reality. And one of I don't know if you read Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley
Everybody
Robinson,
keeps telling me to read it, but I haven't read it.
One of the things I really liked about it, it starts with an epic tragedy in India where the water is practically boiling and thousands of people die, which is a kind of wake-up call. But the middle part is deeply depressing because all the things that are predicted are happening. There's a little bit of a comeback at the end. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is the comeback is in all different forms. The lawyers sue. Politicians finally reluctantly pass laws. Mm-hmm. The monkey wrenchers monkey wrench. The writers write. Half Earth becomes a big thing, mm-hmm. like putting land aside. So I like that disparate ways of fighting back, are there. Last night I did a reading in Mancos, Colorado, and a young professor from Durango said to me, what would your advice be to the young people he's teaching? And it's kind of like writing advice. It's like, find your voice.
Yes.
I don't expect, I wouldn't have been a good Hadley's a natural activist. I'm not. You're doing this. People can find within their worlds a way to acknowledge the fact that, to do that empathy exercise, think ahead to climate, and then what can I individually do?
Is that a little bit, have you evolved on that, or has your thinking kind of firmed up? Because I remember a while back when the TR book came out, and I remember, I don't know if it was on the podcast or just when we were talking on the phone, but it was almost like, I think I need to be doing more than writing. I need to be an activist. I didn't have an opinion one way or the other, but now it seems from what you're saying now that you have accepted that writing is the best tool you have to do this work.
Okay, here's how I'm going to answer. And I think I might have said this on an earlier podcast. I apologize if I did.
No, that's fine.
But early on in my career, I kept being called a naturalist and a nature writer, and I wrote Sick of Nature in response. One thing about that is I now think that every book should be called Sick of the Last Book, because you get obsessed, you're spending 3 or 4 years doing something, and then the last thing you want to do is you want to move the other way. So this book is kind of me saying exactly what you just said and saying, this is my contribution is to write the book.
Yeah.
Now I think I might want to become a little bit more of an activist.
Really?
Because the particular issue, which is, conservation corridors and putting land aside, it snuck into the Teddy book. It snuck into other books. Now I want to face it fully, because to me, it's a big, bold idea, as I say in the Roosevelt book, like parks once were. And I think I could be a decent spokesman for it.
Sure.
And write about it in a bold, interesting way. So I'm going to do some journalism on it. But now the dog isn't it's licking its crotch. So if you hear any slurping noises in the background, that's what it is. So I think I could, I really could kind of, be helpful in that arena.
Yeah.
And hopefully it'll coincide with my move back west, my long fantasized. So if anybody out there has a job, a good job, like executive director of something,
we can find that.
Yeah, we can
hook that up.
So
I just recently talked to Doug Peacocks, who's done a lot on that specific issue of this major land connection between U.S. and Canada for wildlife and bears. And Doug, I mean, he's still going strong and he's still got that fire, but he's 81.
Yeah.
And there's this generation of guys that he came up with, and we talked a bit about this, that, just even if they're in the best health in the world, they're not going to be around much longer. Yeah. And when you look around, who do you see that's doing the kind of work that's going to replace those people? Not replace, that's not the right word. Build on what they've built and be the new innovators. Is there anybody that comes to mind, or maybe even any issues that people are working on that come to mind?
Well, when you say that, I think immediately of Gary Snyder and Wendell Berry, who are both, I think they're like 90 and 91. So pretty soon I'm going to be with the old guy generation. I'm going to be like with my white beard and come to him for wisdom.
I think my beard's whiter than yours, though.
Okay. So, I do know a lot. I mean, it's funny. Years ago, Orion magazine, they had always done these think tanks and with the nature writers of the time, and someone called them Gary, Barry, and Terry. And you can figure out who's who. And then about 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, they decided to have a younger generation of that. And the rule was 45 and under. And I was 48, and they let me in by virtue of immaturity. But you had in that group, you had Camille Dungy, Drew Lanham, you had Joe Wilkins, you had Craig Childs, you had, I'm forgetting a lot of people. I hope they don't hear this podcast.
We'll find a list.
Yeah.
We'll find a list.
But Ginger Strand is another person. Kate Miles. Anyway, there's a whole group of people there who are strong. And then there's a whole younger, I just spent 3 days with Zach Podmore, who is great young writer, but he's also an environmentalist. He's writes for the Salt Lake Tribune about San Juan County. He's an expert rafter. He's a ranger. So this guy, he's got all the tools, and there are a lot of younger people like that. And one interesting thing I said to this professor, whose name I wish I could remember last night, he was objecting to my saying that my things about repression, and he said, "Well, I think about it all day long," and I thought about that, and I said, "Well, that's because it's your job. Your job is to conservation biologist thinking about climate." And I think the younger generation, that's part of the answer. Make it your job. Yeah. This is the life or death issue. There are a lot of exciting career things you can do with that. And I've seen people do that.
Yeah.
So that's the area where, if I'd still write because I can't help it. It's chronic. But if I were, seeking a career as a younger person, I would have it deal with what I call in the book, and it is the largest existential issue of our time.
I don't understand. Just before we met up, I was interviewing the person from Nature Conservancy who does all their forest health and wildfire work, and that'll come out after this episode. But I mentioned to him, I just don't understand why the whole climate change issue is considered like a left-wing hippy-dippy kind of thing. Because if you think, it is, if it could be framed as the most selfish thing in the world, like the best thing for humans. Yeah. Because the bottom line, like when we're gone, and we will be gone at some point, the Earth's going to keep going. Unless an asteroid hits it or the sun burns out, the Earth's going to keep going. As humans, we're doing this it is for nature and all that, but it's ultimately, it could be argued that it's for ourselves too. Yeah. And so that seems to me to be possibly even more on the right-wing spectrum than the left, of just, this is for us. And so I don't understand. I just don't get it, but I don't get a lot of things these days.
I did not find that on the ground. I did not find that in places like, as I said, for instance, the guy who looked like ZZ Top, who I interviewed in the diner in Paradise, one of his worries, I don't know if his guns had gone off. He put them in a safe before the Paradise fire, and the guns had heated up and gone off, and then water had gotten in, and he'd lost his guns. But it was a good conversation, and it wasn't. I don't hear a lot of denial out there. You might call it a different. The weather's weird, but I just feel like that one's going to be in the rearview mirror pretty soon.
I think there's 7% of America. In my conversation with Catherine Hayhoe, the climate scientist, the number she had was there's 7% that just straight up deny it, refuse to exist. But other than that, everybody else is beyond that. 93% of us are ready to talk. But
3%, only 3% consider it our most pressing issue.
I saw that in your book.
And also, I think it's like 66% don't ever discuss it with their family and good friends. And then you've got all the studies of the kids, like the Lancet study of 10,000 kids from different countries, where I forget it's a majority have regular climate depressive thoughts. And so, it's a weird mix of people's being aware of it, not regarding it as crucial, not talking about it. I think it's, like I say, it's like repression and denial. And if anything, I don't think of this as a overtly, stridently political book, but, the main message is I want to grab people and shake them and just say, what you do with that is up to you. Yeah. But this is something that's there. But I like that statistic about 7%, because that's what I found. I half the people I talk to are my political opposites. I'm pretty liberal, and I'm not hearing people go, "Oh, that sixth hurricane of the last 4 years isn't real."
Sure,
I'm not hearing that.
That was one of the reasons I started this podcast, because I was living here in Boulder, and I would, my next door neighbor, as I say, could have been considered a militant environmentalist. And then I'd go out and talk with a rancher, because I was selling ranches at that right wing, Trump bumper sticker. And what I realized was that these two people that are on seem to be on opposite ends of the spectrum are probably on the same page. Well, probably 80% of the when it comes to the land and the environment. And that was one of the things that spurred me to start this, because I'm like, I'm seeing both extremes, or what should be extremes, and there's a lot more in common than there is separate, which is that's a good feeling.
Well, yeah, that's, I've always said, like, my kind of aesthetic, my MO is a man walks into a bar. Years ago, it might have been for the Ed Abbey Wallace Stegner book, I went into a bar in Vernal, Utah to write a piece against, all-terrain vehicles, ran into a guy who was passionate about them, and went ATVing with him the next morning. Kind of thing. And, I think that in the pre-Trump days, I found this all the time, that the world I encountered was not the world of MSNBC versus Fox in real life. It was the world of being able to have a beer with somebody and talk about him. And like with Ryan Lambert, where he used to tease me and call Obama, "You're president," and that was fine. And I pushed back, and he's a pretty big guy. He's a little scary sometimes, but I pushed back anyway. And, just finding that in the world, it was more complicated and messier. And going out again for this book, it was too. But I do think that the political climate has obviously made people quicker to hate.
Yeah. I don't know, too much information. I think if we can cut down information consumption and high fructose corn syrup consumption by 99%, the world would improve across the board. We need to do that. Maybe. Do you think that would go over well if Joe Biden tried to put a law in?
And maybe hard liquor as well. Not beer, God help us.
So give me some good books that you've read recently that I have not read.
Well, you got to read Ministry for the Future, because everybody's telling you to. Overstory, obviously, is a great one that one of the things it did so well was take kind of biocentric, enviro thinking and turn it into a real story, where people could get it. Oh, wait, trees are real too. It's not just humans. What have I read recently? I wrote about Drew Lanham's home place in my last book.
He's great.
Yeah, you interviewed him?
I interviewed him. I'm going to make an exception because South Carolina is hard to say the West, but I interviewed him for a Colorado Parks and Wildlife event, but it didn't come out on the podcast. But he comes up so much. He came up with Doug Peacocks. He comes up with you. I just had such a wonderful conversation with him, and we've stayed in touch a bit. And so I'm gonna make that happen soon, hopefully.
I feel like I want to name something a little more obscure, because the next one I was going to say was Robin Kimmerer, but that book has gone from being kind of an obscure milkweed title to a New York Times bestseller, it deserves to be. And one thing that she's got on top of everything else is a really good sense of humor.
I have not read that, which is so embarrassing. It keeps coming up.
Braiding Sweetgrass.
Yes.
We didn't give the title. Let me think. Really, what did I just read that was great? I've been reading, it's kind of boring, but I've been thinking a lot about myths in the West. I see that Betsy Quammen has a really interesting book coming up called True West that I haven't read, but I've been going back and reading Stegner and Devoto, just like thinking about the cowboy myth versus what we really have here. So I know something will pop up later.
I didn't know anything about Devoto until I learned it from you in All the Wild That Remains. I think it was All the Wild That Remains. You talk about it a lot. Yeah. And that was the first I'd heard of it. And I recently had author Nate Schweber, it was maybe a year now, who wrote a whole book about Bernard Devoto. That's really a fascinating guy. But anyway, that brings me to, I'm not trying to be an ass kisser here, but seriously, like, your work is one of the main factors that got me on this trajectory. Reading your stuff. And, I remember when we first met and did the podcast, and then we've ended up staying in touch. And it's just, I can't overstate how your work and your influence has led to this podcast. And if anybody hates the podcast, it's my fault. If you love the podcast, Mr. Gessner gets a lot of the credit. But it's seriously, like, your writing, I mean, if you ever think about, what's the impact? Like, I am the impact.
Well,
so
thank you.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And it's just so cool that you're so cool and fun to hang out with. And I'd admired you for so long before we met. So it's just, you've made my life infinitely better. So I appreciate it.
Well, that really is great to hear. Sometimes when you're writing, you feel a little bit isolated, not just in the writing, but in trying to get it out into the world. Mm-hmm. And you think just in terms of numbers, not in terms of impact. I think we talked about the Thoreau book. Mm-hmm. But the first scene in there is when I have Hadley on my shoulders.
Yes.
And I point to the foundation of Thoreau's cabin and say, that's where the man lived who ruined Daddy's life. And I really feel like those early books, just like you're saying, made me think about a life of being more of a nonconformist and mm-hmm. pursuing dreams. And that means you lose something. And often what you lose is cash and obvious status and obvious things. So you have to kind of develop these internal resources. And it really helps to have writers you admire mm-hmm. and people you admire who kind of help you see, because times it can be tough too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember going to college reunions and being like, holy crap, mm-hmm. these people have their lives and they're moving ahead. And I'm just kind of treading water, trying to do this thing that I don't even know what this thing really is. So it's been really fun to watch the podcast to, become more, and not just more prominent, but it seems like you're really taking it up to another level, and it's exciting to watch.
Well, I just appreciate it. I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate the books. I love the new book. This episode will come out on the publication date.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great.
And so people can click through, buy 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 copies.
Yeah. 12.
Yeah, 12, 600 copies. But I love it. Love everything you do. Thank you for taking the time. Good to see you.
Thanks, Ed.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. 1 email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. But thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.